Well, here we are. Welcome to my presentation. I would like to thank the Bishop Hill Heritage Association and the Gettysburg Community Foundation for sponsoring my program. Congratulations to the entire community on the 175th anniversary of the founding of Bishop Hill. I'm honored to be a part of this program. Gonna show you some more pictures here. This is a map of Sweden. You can see Stockholm there. You all know about Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. And then if you travel west on E18, you come to the area where Erik Jensen was active in the beginning, and Todd is showing you the area there. We're gonna go into more details later on. But then if you travel the Interstate E4 north, you come to Uppsala. And then to the left, you have the town of Tänsjö. And that's where the people from Nora Parish came from. And you can read about those people in my book. There are a lot of letters that I have translated from people who lived in Nora. And then if you travel farther north on E4, you come to the seaport of Gävle. By the way, Galva is named after that city, only pronounced differently. And many of the Janstenists, they sailed from Gävle to America. Okay, we go to the next. The first woman I'm going to talk about is Majastina Jensen. She was the wife of the self-proclaimed prophet and leader, Erik Jensen. She lost 7 of her 9 children and died much too young. Next. So here is a more detailed map of the area. You see Biskopskulla there, that's where Erik Jensen was born. I'll go back to that map again. Okay, and then if you go to the left, you see where Majastina was born, his wife. Now these places are not located far apart, maybe just a couple of miles apart. And I have trouble reading from here. Majastina, what does it say? In one place there, Majastina gave birth to her first 2 children and died as babies. And in one place, her surviving children, Erik and Matilda, were born, and also a girl who died. And the map is courtesy of Robert Dahlson. Next. Then the family moved to Forsa in Hälsingland, farther to the north. And that's where Majastina gave birth to Charlotta at Lumnes. And she went with them to America, but did not survive the trip. Next. The next woman I'm going to talk about is Cardin Danielson. She was expelled from the colony. She had many different first and last names. She married outsiders. She lost 4 children. Only 1 survived, and she ended up poor. Here is an excerpt from a Swedish church record where she came from, Åmot parish in Gästrikland. Her father was farmer Daniel Andersson, and his wife was Kajsa Lindbäck. And they had 9 children. The oldest son, he is listed twice, and he stayed at home, and all the other children emigrated to America. Can you imagine? Could you point to Cardin there on that excerpt? It says Cardin. There she is. So this is what a Swedish church book would look like. Next. Here's a picture of Kari as an old woman living in a big brick, smoking a pipe. Now, it wasn't that unusual that women smoked pipes. I ran across it in Minnesota too when I did research about the Minnesota Swedes. But Cardin is also supposed to have chewed snuff or tobacco. Next. The third woman I'm going to talk about is Charlotta Ruth. She signed her name with an X. Most of the women could not write. She married a stranger, John Ruth, resulting in kidnappings and murder. She has gone down in history. And here is a picture of her painted by the colony artist Olof Krantz, and this was in later years. Next, now there is the book. I want to point out that the front cover is from 1846, painted by Olof Krantz, showing the dugouts where they lived at first. They dug them out in the ravine so that they could get shelter. And then on the back cover, it shows Bishop Hill, what it looked like in 1855. That's about 10 years later, they had built this beautiful town. The big building, steam mill to the right, that is no longer there. And the barns to the left are no longer there, but you can still see the steeple building in the back. And you can see Edwards River going across the road there. And if you travel to Bishop Hill from the north, you will see the same bend in the road coming into the village as we see here. The postage stamps is from 1988, when we celebrated the 300th anniversary of the founding of the Swedish colony in Delaware. There were several stamps issued, and this is one that was issued in Sweden to honor Bishop Hill and Olof Krantz. And it was officially dedicated here by the Swedish postmaster in 1988. So now I'm going to tell you a little more in detail about these fascinating women. 175 years ago, hundreds of Swedes came here to establish a religious colony. They had no food and no shelter, and arrived too late in the year to plant crops. Scores of newcomers died the first winter. United in faith and love, the survivors worked for their common good, constructing dugouts in the ravine. The women tore up the hand-woven table linen they had brought from Sweden and made them into towels that they could trade for food. They ground the maize on small coffee grinders they had also brought from Sweden and mixed the cornmeal with bark meal. Cooking for hundreds of people was nothing like they had been used to in Sweden. Here, they made soup outside in a large iron kettle that stood on three legs over a fire. They prepared flax for weaving as early as 1847 and made rag carpets. There weren't enough looms, so they had to work in shifts. They worked in groups that were often from the same parish in Sweden. For instance, a group from Nora parish prepared broomcorn for making brooms. Some women were selected as milkmaids, and I understand that they lived in this building while processing the milk and making butter and cheese. Other women worked outside in construction and in the fields. Periods of hunger led to the drastic decision by Erik Jensen, self-proclaimed prophet, to forbid marriages. When times improved, he arranged for mass weddings and sometimes paired old men with young women. The bride and the groom had no say in the matter. Some of these forced marriages ended in divorce. Women were not inclined to flee the colony to go and live on an isolated homestead. They preferred the familiar protection of other colony women, especially when giving birth. Although I was surprised to learn they had no designated midwife. The women believed Jensen when he said that those who left the colony would sacrifice their souls. The first woman I'm calling attention to is Majastina Jensen, the first wife of Erik Jensen. She was born in 1815, and she was 7 years younger than her husband. Majastina started to work as a maid in 1830 for Erik Jensen's parents. When Majastina married the son of the house, Erik, in November 1835, at the age of 20, his father accused him of marrying below his station in life and did not allow the bride to sit down at the table for her own wedding dinner. Apparently, the wedding was not hosted by the bride's parents, as was the custom. Erik admitted that they were expecting a child at the time of marriage. The bride might have had to cook and serve the wedding dinner. Erik rented a small farm in Torstuna, where Majastina gave birth to their first child, a boy named Johannes, 6 months after the marriage. The child died at the age of 6 months of pneumonia. Their second child, Lovisa, was born 15 months after the first, also in Torstuna. Sadly, the girl died of whooping cough when she was 3 months old. I've been told that a baby afflicted with whooping cough would choke to death unless it was constantly held in an upright position. So far, Majastina had carried 2 children to term and nursed them through the first critical months when she lost them. The next child Majastina lost was Sarah Johanna, born in 1840. The girl lived only 6 hours and died on the same date she was born. Most likely, Majastina had to stay home to take care of the children and the farm while her husband held his meetings that were unlawful at the time because no minister was present. Jensen was a farmer and a self-taught Bible reader who had his own ideas about salvation. When he was hiding from the authorities for weeks at a time, his wife must have wondered where he was. On 3 occasions, Majastina attended meetings that were interrupted by protesters. After Jensen's friends had kidnapped him while he was in transport to the prison in Gävle, his followers spread rumors about him saying he was dead. Majastina then dressed as a widow and sighed deeply whenever her husband's name was mentioned. We know that Majastina was pregnant again when she traveled to Norway for their voyage to America, together with their 3 surviving children, Erik, 8, Matilda, 4, and 2-year-old Charlotta. After Charlotta was born in Forsa, after the family had moved there. They were accompanied by 3 women and 1 man. Olof Norlund was the man's name. Erik was a fugitive from justice and could not get his own passport, so the plan for him was to use the passport of Erik Larsson of Kingsta, and presumably Majastina would travel on Mrs. Larsson's passport. Nordlund escorted the party to Christiania, now Oslo in Norway. This journey must have taken place while it was still winter, and to cross the mountains it must have included skis, horses, and a sled that Nordlund had to return to Sweden. In Christiania, Erik Jensen, his family and friends boarded a ship to Copenhagen, Denmark. From there, they went by train to Hamburg, Germany, where they boarded a ship to Hull, England, and then traveled the usual route by train to Liverpool and on to New York, arriving there in late March or early April 1846. Although we know that Erik and Majastina were supposed to have used the Larsson couple's passports, they have not been found on any manifest of ships arriving in New York. The fourth child Majastina lost was 2-year-old Charlotta, who died during the journey to America. Some say that she died during the voyage. Of the 6 children Majastina had given birth to so far, only Erik and Matilda were alive. They both lived long lives in America. Upon arrival in New York, Majastina was close to giving birth again. And the family and friends waited while she delivered a stillborn son and had recovered sufficiently to continue the journey. A different account says that the child was alive but died soon after birth. One source says that Majastina gave birth while they waited to go through immigration. It was the 5th child Majastina had lost so far. They arrived in Victoria, Illinois in July of 1846, where the Jensen family stayed with Jonas Hedström, the Swedish Methodist minister. Erik's and Majastina's son, who was 8 years old at the time, recalled that snakes came through the chinks in the wall of the cabin and were sometimes found in the bunks. At one time, it rained so heavily that the roof leaked, and they all had to huddle under an old umbrella. Majastina may have expected better accommodations in America. When the daughter Matilda was 15 years old, she recalled that it was winter when they arrived in Bishop Hill, that they lived in tents and hardly had anything to eat. It must have been a relief for Majastina to move into a frame house built for the family in 1847. Her husband no longer had to go out and preach and could finally stay at home. There are no records of Majastina giving birth while living in the colony, but thanks to her son, we know that 2 babies were born to her here in Bishop Hill. They died with their mother on the Arsenal Island, Rock Island, in September 1849, where Jensen thought they would be safe from the cholera. Majastina and her 2 youngest were buried in an unmarked grave. Jensen may have had to dig the grave himself. Majastina was only 34 years old when she died. Had she lived longer, she could have had more children. As it were, she had given birth to 9 babies and lost 7. The second colony woman I'm calling attention to is Cardin Danielson. In Sweden, there is a saying that a dear child has many names, and this was certainly true for Cardin. She went by the name of Katarina, Karin, Kari, Kate, Kara, or Forsvik Kara, supposedly after the place of birth. In Sweden, she was called Kajsa. She was born in 1828 in the Ockelbo area in Gästrikland as the daughter of farmer Daniel Andersson and his wife Kajsa Lindbäck. I will call her Kari because most often she seems to have gone by that name in Bishop Hill. Kari and her siblings, Anna, Lisa, Daniel, Jonas, Samuel, and Majastina, sailed on the ship New York, arriving in New York in March of 1847. The colony membership book lists one additional sibling, David. Heading the family was the eldest sister, Anna Peterson, a married woman. Kari is listed as Katarina with the notation gått hem, meaning that she had left the colony. When I saw that, I thought she had died, but to the colonists, perhaps that was the same thing. They left the colony, so they died. Here it does not say why she had left, but we will find out later. A Swedish researcher, Elsa Lagervik, reportedly stated that Kari, or Kajsa, emigrated in 1848 with her son Per without a husband. The statement, without a husband, could mean that she was unmarried. It's also possible that she fled from her husband because he was not a Jansenist. Be that as it may, the colony membership book states that she arrived in 1847, but her son Per is not listed with her. Perhaps he had died during the journey. Kari was one of the women who made bricks in Bishop Hill. She carved her initials KDD for Cardin Danielson, or KD 49 for the year, into the bricks she made. She may also have been one of the women who could toss bricks to the masons working on the upper floors of the massive 96-room big brick constructed 1848-51, where Kari later lived. By the way, that building burned down in 1928. In 1855, Kari was expelled from the colony as the only woman on record to have been expelled. The colony minutes of May 7, 1855 shows it in writing. Cardin Danielson, being present, was expelled from membership of the colony in conformity with Article 3, the third section of the bylaws, which stated, "Any member who shall be guilty of disturbing the peace and harmony of this colony by vicious and wicked conduct, or by preaching and disseminating doctrines of religious beliefs contrary to the doctrines of the Bible, may be expelled." What could she have done? 10 men were expelled along with Kari. The men were surely needed as workers to farm thousands of acres and run all the workshops, and so was Kari, who could do men's work. At that time, about 800 people lived in the colony, the highest number ever recorded. In 1858, the membership was down to 655, with only 22% of them being men above the age of 20. The women above the age of 20 made up almost 40% of the total population. I was told by one descendant that Kari and her sister Elisabeth had gone to Gersburg to get married, but I could not verify this in any public records. We know that Elisabeth and her fiancé, Johan or John Granat, a tailor, fled the colony to get married because there was a marriage ban in the colony. They couldn't get married there. So they worked, both of them worked in a tailor shop where they, away from the probing eyes of the leaders. They lived in Galesburg until Elizabeth died in 1875. They had at least 3 daughters, Ida Wall, Annie Johnson, and Maggie Tolgren. Kari's sister, Betsy Henderson, settled at Red Oak Grove, and her sister Martha Jäderqvist near Victoria. I mention these names in case you know of any descendants. Many colonists who had left voluntarily to farm on their own wrote letters to Sweden calling Bishop Hill a slave nest and praised the opportunities to make their living on the rich farmland in the area. After Kari had returned to Bishop Hill, she occasionally accompanied Jonas, her brother, on his hikes to Buck Grove to pick berries or gather nuts. She went to the Bowman farm south of Bishop Hill to get eggs and other farm produce. Kate was known as a whisk maker, called vispar in Swedish, used to stir puddings and gravies to make them lump-free. They were made of twigs from the cottonwood trees or poplars that grew below the colony school on the south side of the road going down the hill. Kate tied the twigs together until they resembled small brooms. Perhaps she sold them to help her with her living expenses. Kari was known to smoke a pipe and chew snuff. She had to have money to buy tobacco. I learned that Kari had a son by the name of Pete Williams and found a 13-year-old boy in the 1880 census as living with Eric Jensen's daughter, Tilda Warner, and her children, Charlie and Mary, in Weller Township, which includes Bishop Hill. Peter was listed as having an Irish father and a Swedish mother. Of course, the Swedish mother was Kari. Had Kari been married to a Mr. Williams? It could explain why it was so difficult to find her in public records. On December 13, 1882, Galva Standard reported that Kari and her son had gone with Elder Andrew Blomberg to Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, with the intention of making Pleasant Hill their home. As many of you know, there was a Shaker colony in Pleasant Hill that practiced celibacy. Did they go there in the hope of being cared for? Were they disappointed or just homesick? Because we know that they did return to Bishop Hill, but we don't know when. Peter Williams' name appeared in Galva News a few times between 1892 and 1906, stating that he spent up to 3 years away from Bishop Hill, traveling in Western and Northwestern America, as well as in the South, and that he stayed for months in Chicago during the World's Fair in 1893. In 1894, he had begun to work at the Rock Island and Pacific Railroad as a stoker, but nothing was said about his mother. From a clipping in Minnie Schulberg's scrapbooks, I learned that Kari's last name was Forsman. She and her brother Jonas Danielson were taken to the county infirmary in 1908 because the village board had decided they would be better off there. They had no land and there was no social security, so their living conditions could not have been good. Having read that notice, I knew that Kari had married a man by the last name of Forsman, and I found her in the federal census for 1900, where she was listed as living in Bishop Hill as Kate Forsman, a widow with 5 live births noted, but with only 1 living child. Her surviving son was not listed with her. There is so much we don't know. Cardin died May 4th, 1918, at the age of 90 at the poorhouse. She and her brother Jonas are buried in a cemetery east of what is now Hillcrest Nursing Home. There is a simple obituary for Jonas, but none for Cardin. More research is needed to find out where Cardin lived between 1855 and 1882, about her marriages and her children. The best-known woman in colony history is no doubt Charlotta Ruth, born in 1824 in Dumta, Österunda. Two strong men, Erik Jensen and the stranger, John Ruth, who became her husband, fought fiercely for custody of her. John Ruth has been described as a handsome veteran of the Mexican-American War. He has also been described as a scoundrel. Together with two other men, he came to Bishop Hill to look for a wife. Single women were scarce on the frontier, and in Bishop Hill there were plenty of them. But why did he select Charlotta, the cousin of Erik Jensen? As far as we know, she didn't stand out as being especially beautiful, but then we have only a portrait of her that Olof Krantz painted many years later. John and Charlotta probably fell in love. We can assume that other young single women in the colony were jealous of Charlotta, and she must have been flattered to have been the chosen one. There were many more women in the colony than men, and the women's prospects for marriage were slim. But since Erik Jensen was the so-called guardian of the orphan girl, he felt he had to agree to the marriage. It's hard to believe that he would permit a stranger to marry Charlotta. As far as we know, Ruth could not contribute anything to the common purse. But Jensen had one condition he thought would guarantee that they stayed in the colony. He reportedly wrote a paper saying that if Ruth should leave the colony, Charlotta would have the right to stay. I happened to see this small slip of paper when I did research in Edla Warner's house in 1971. Charlotta had signed it with an X, but John Ruth had not signed. When my husband Leonard microfilmed the colony papers in the schoolhouse, he didn't get access to the collections. Instead, Edla Warner decided which documents should be filmed. She didn't hand over that particular note, and apparently no one has seen it since I did. John Ruth always said that he had not signed it, and he would have been a fool to do so. John Ruth disappeared from Bishop Hill for long periods of time, and in the meantime, Charlotta gave birth to their son in 1849. With the cholera threatening them all, Ruth said he wanted to move his wife and his son away from the crowded conditions. He took his family to Charlotta's sister in Chicago, but Jensen soon found out where they were and sent some of his men to bring her and the baby back to Bishop Hill. This angered Ruth, and it wasn't long before he picked up his family again. They didn't make it very far before Jensen's men were in pursuit and grabbed Charlotta and the child. Ruth then gathered a few friends who threatened to burn down the colony if his wife and son were not returned to him. Matilda and others referred to it as the mob. But Jensen evidently had taken them to St. Louis, so the men had to leave without them. Some Americans sided with Ruth, saying that in the United States, a man had the right to his wife. In my new book, there is a letter from one of the neighbors who states that Ruth spoke and wrote fluent English. On the 13th of May, 1850, Jensen was in Hendrick County Courthouse to answer in a case against him. when Ruth appeared in the open window, saying, "You have taken my wife and child away from me. I no longer have anything to live for, but you shall die first." To which Jensen replied, "A sow is good enough for you." For the young people here who don't know what a sow is, it's a mother pig. Jensen is known to have used vulgar language. With that, Ruth aimed his pistol at Jensen and shot him dead. There were several eyewitnesses, and Ruth did not resist arrest. If he had planned on killing himself, he didn't. Charlotta obtained a divorce, and Ruth served 2 years in prison for manslaughter, not for murder. He had yet to be sentenced when he was pardoned by the governor due to the many petitions from Americans. Ruth lived a few years in misery in Chicago, and when he died of a heart condition, he received a Christian burial attended by many Chicago Swedes. Someone said that the murder of Erik Jensen resulted in the fulfillment of only one person, Charlotta, who was now free from the demands of both Erik Jensen and her husband. She could live in peace, and she chose to live in the colony. At the dissolution, she received a parcel of land that supported her and her son, also called John, who grew up to become a respected attorney in Galva. It's probably safe to assume that he had inherited some of his intellect from his father. Although many researchers have tried to learn who John Ruth really was, Sr., no one has been successful so far. He said himself that he was from Stockholm. Others have said that he was related to Mrs. Margaret Hebbe, who was from Stockholm, and one of the teachers in the colony before she moved to Gettysburg in 1849. Her move could have been coincided with a controversy about John Ruth. Mrs. Hebbe was originally from Söderala, Hälsingland. Charlotta died in 1905 at the home of her son in Galva at the age of 80. Her obituary says that her name was Charlotte Louise Ruth Anderson. Someone suggested to me that Anderson was derived from her father's surname. The obituary also said, "She enjoyed the best of health during nearly her entire life and was active and energetic in the household and other duties in the early years after the breaking up of the colony and after the death of her husband. She managed the farm with ability and success. As we know, her husband was long gone by the time she had the farm, and he was not a farmer." Sometimes obituaries can be misleading. In my new book, Bishop Hill Reframed, Voices from the Past, I have included short letters from women and also written about the celibacy issue that depended on the women's vote in 1856. It was the only time they were allowed to vote. When the leaders forbade marriages between young folks, it led to protests that were punished by shunning and expulsions, but also resulted in defections from the colony. These and other controversies led to disunity. It was the men who ruled the colony. The leaders took out huge loans, and when these were due, it became necessary to sell large tracts of land and dissolved the corporation in 1860-61. Today, we're happy to see the many original buildings still standing to remind us of the time when the Swedish pioneers, men and women, built a town out of nothingness. Lastly, I would like to give credit to Robert Nelson, a colony descendant residing in Wisconsin, for providing the maps and other source material for my presentation, and also to Cheryl Dowell, Bishop Hill, for answering many questions.